We are very much pleased to welcome you tonight. For those of you who are visiting Blake for the first time, I feel compelled to just take a minute and orient you. We are meeting here in the Juliet Nelson Auditorium, and it's a space where twice a week, our 525 upper school students gather to hear each one of our seniors deliver their senior speech. It's a rite of passage at Blake, and it's also a graduation requirement. On this stage, over the decades, thousands of students have told their own stories. Stories about immigrating, coming out, coming to Blake, going fishing, learning another language, losing a loved one, climbing a mountain, taking a risk, making a terrible decision, learning from having made a terrible decision. Every imaginable iteration of the human experience, some familiar and some less so. Collectively, their stories have helped our community come together to celebrate, to reflect, to argue, to grieve in a continuous and evolving understanding of our shared and unique identities. How appropriate then to gather in this space to welcome Eboo Patel, interfaith educator, leader, and master storyteller. Patel is a leading voice in the movement for interfaith cooperation and the founder and president of Interfaith Youth Corps, a national nonprofit working to make interfaith cooperation a social norm. He is the author of Acts of Faith, Sacred Ground, and Interfaith Leadership. Named by U.S. News and World Report as one of America's best leaders of 2009, he served on President Obama's inaugural Faith Council. He is a regular contributor to the public conversation around religion in America and a frequent speaker on the topic of religious pluralism. He holds a doctorate in the sociology of religion from Oxford University, where he studied on a Rhodes Scholarship. For over 15 years, he has worked with governments, social sector organizations, and college and university campuses to help realize a future where religion is a bridge of cooperation rather than a barrier of division. Absent from that biography, incredible though it may be, is today's eavesdropped hallway comment from a sophomore boy. OMG, literally the best public speaker I have ever heard. Few higher words of praise exist. Please join me in welcoming Eboo Patel.
Thank you. That is actually really high praise. I say to myself anytime I walk into a school, today you will not bore teenagers, right? That is my goal, to not bore teenagers. So I'm glad that at least that teenager was not bored for that particular 45 minutes. So there's a story that Bill Moyers tells about changing religious demographics in America. It goes like this. There's two guys sitting in a cafe in California. He tells it as if it's a bar, but I'm a Muslim, so it's a cafe. Two guys sitting in a cafe in California. One's kind of a shaggy-haired guy, and he asks his friend, he says, "Do you know anything about Eastern religions?" And his friend says, "Sure. I knew some Methodists when I lived in Pennsylvania." Not every audience laughs at that joke, but this is Minnesota. I thought that you guys would give me a smile. Thank you for that. We're off to a good start. Notice I did not tell that to your upper school today. I know my audience. So part of what I want to do is to tell you the story of how I come to care about religious identity and diversity issues, and how over the course of the past 15 or 20 years, it's become increasingly clear to me that these are issues that are going to be shaping in our nation, in our world, in this century. And part of what's been interesting to me is that for all of the talk of identity and diversity issues, particularly in progressive spaces, and I would say that Blake School would be one of those. There is relatively little attention given to religious identity and diversity issues. And so the story that I want to tell begins with a personal story, and I think moves into a national story and a global story. So one of the things that struck me about being here today and speaking with your students is how open conversations about identity are. And there's an openness about people's various identities, right? There's gender-neutral bathrooms, there's LGBTQIA signs, there's Muslim girl in hijab on a mural upstairs saying, my identity is not the problem, your eyes are the problem, kind of thing, right? And when I contrast my own high school experience with that, it's just so different. It's so different, right? I grew up at an excellent public school. It was top-rated public school in the state of Illinois my first year, in the western suburbs of Chicago. Academically elite as far as a public school goes, but there was a dominant culture, and everybody else wanted to be part of it. Case closed. No questions, no conversation, right? No sense of we are different and unique, and we ought to celebrate that in these ways. It wasn't overtly racist. It wasn't hegemonic in ugly ways. There was just a sense of here's who we are, and if you're not already in that, you should try to be in that, right? And I heard a student today, she might even be here tonight, quote the David Foster Wallace Kenyon College essay. Is that student here tonight? She was here for the dinner earlier. Anyway, it's a perfect essay for this this part of the talk, because when you're in that environment, you have no idea that that's not the whole world, right? That's the world that you're in. So the David Foster Wallace insight into this says there's two fish swimming in water, and they come upon an older fish, and the older fish says, "How's the water, boys?" And the two younger fish swim away, and one turns to the other and says, "What the heck is water?" Right? So if you had asked me when I was 16, what's your identity? I'd be like, the heck is identity? Right? So I get to college and things are different. It's the fall of 1993, and it's an inflection point in the multicultural movement. You can't walk 10 feet in any direction without seeing people read Cornel West or bell hooks. It was the fall of the apartheid era. There were demonstrations about South Africa everywhere. The Rodney King events had just happened, caused a major kerfuffle. The OJ events were a year away. I mean, these issues were extremely salient. And as you might expect, I started to read my story through the prism of these issues. And a set of events that happened to me that first year still seem so present, even though it was about 20 years ago now. So here's one of those stories. Amy Tan's novel, The Joy Luck Club, had just been made into a movie. And I went to it one Friday evening with it's the story of, it's one of the first broadly read fictional narratives of the coming of age of second generation Asians. Okay, in this case, Chinese Americans. And I went to see this movie with a couple of guys from my residence hall, and like a third of the way through, like I can barely keep my eyes dry, right? Sorry about that. It's a dramatic moment. Thank you for sharing it with me. I can hardly keep my eyes dry. I mean, this is basically my story, right? Like my parents focused on academic excellence, their notion of passing on tradition. What I read is their strictness vis-a-vis other families, flexibility, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm like, this is like deeply moving to me, right? And lights come up after the movie's over, and I'm like looking at 4 yawning kids from my residence hall. They're like, that was dumb. Let's go to Taco Bell. And I'm like, did you not know that you just watched the story of my life? And they didn't know, right? And it's not like something like that had never happened to me. But the difference about being in college is there's a conversation around it. And so all of a sudden, being a person of color, I'd never heard that term in my life, right? Being a minority, I'd only thought of that like in history textbooks, but now I was applying it to myself. And I was starting to kind of read my experience through the lens of what does it feel like to be an American other, a person of color. And a whole set of things in my past and my life kind of start to make sense to me. There was a time when I was trick-or-treating, I was in like 6th grade, my brother was in 4th grade, And we were trick-or-treating around our neighborhood on Halloween, and we walked up to a house right after these two kids who lived a few blocks away were there. And so the woman who's opening the door sees 4 kids there, right? And so she smiles and she says, "Are all of you together?" And the 2 kids in front of us point to my brother and they're like, "We're not with them." And I knew at that time that had everything to do with the pigment in my skin, but I didn't really want to admit it to myself because I thought the problem was the pigment in my skin, right? And when you start to have a conversation around it in college, you have language for it. You have frameworks for it. You have theories for it. And I was 17 and mad, right? Because a whole set of things in my life start to click and make sense. Other things click and make sense also. I mean, I remember being in the computer lab at the University of Illinois typing a sociology paper, and my fingers are doing this, right? And there's a girl in my class, a couple rows over in the computer lab, typing the same paper, and she's going like this. And I kind of look over, and I chortled rudely. And she looks at me, and she's like, "Hey, how many computers were in your high school?" I'm like, "I don't know, 50? She's like, "We had 2. Oh, not everybody learns how to type growing up, right? You go to Glenbard South High School in Glen Ellyn, Illinois, and typing is required because you're going to college. Grow up elsewhere might not be the case. Who feels like the jerk now?" Angels in America had just come out early 1990s, and I probably saw 3 versions of it in the fall of my first year. I saw it in Champaign, I saw it twice in Chicago. It blew me away, right? And it embarrassed me because here were these fulsome 3-dimensional portrayals of gay folks. And I had joked on the playground senior year of high school that I was rooming with my best friend from high school and college because I didn't want to get randomly assigned a gay person. The real reason I was rooming with my best friend was because I was too scared of not being liked by a randomly assigned roommate. But I felt that being a jerk about gay folks was a reasonable cover for that. I wasn't the only kid who did that in Glen Ellyn at that time. And so these variety of identity issues become present to me, ways in which my own experience had been entirely shaped by the pigment in my skin, ways in which my experience as somebody who grows up in a professional middle-class suburb with a very strong, dominant culture, significant parts of which I am part of, has shaped my view of the world and how I've treated other people. And as I said, when all of these things converge and you're 17 or 18, at least when you're me, I mean, it's an intense time, right? And also, at least if you're me at that time, and your parents live 2.5 hours away, and they're willing to do laundry for you, and you get tired of cafeteria food in residence halls, and your parents are happy to send you back home with Tupperware containers full of fresh Indian food. You go home every 6 weeks or so. That's when the laundry runs out. And my parents would dutifully do the laundry for me and fill my Tupperware containers up. And I, with the zeal of the recent convert, would give my father long lectures on people of color consciousness, much of which he was good-natured about. He did say to me at one point, "If you use the word bourgeois in my house ever again, you need to find some other bourgeois father to pay your bourgeois college tuition." It was a useful dose of pragmatic reality. At one point, though, he does say to me, "You know, Eboo, for all you talk about identity consciousness issues and people of color consciousness issues," and he's like, "Look, what you're saying is true. You know, we knew that there was a cost when we moved to Glen Ellyn. We knew that there was a huge upside, right? There was a huge upside in the education, and there was a cost in terms of the diversity. And you are now starting to understand that. And I am sad about that cost. And still, he said, it's interesting to me, Eboo, that you can like quote every footnote of Judith Butler, but you don't appear to even glance at the front page of the New York Times. The next time that you want to give me a long lecture about people of color consciousness, I first want you to tell me how we solve religious diversity conflict issues. And I rolled my eyes, and I think that I yawned for dramatic effect. I mean, this was 1995. Who talks about religion in 1995? I mean, really, right? Paul Simon had just put out The Rhythm of the Saints. There was a great cut called Proof. Proof is an island, and faith is an island in the setting sun. Proof is the bottom line for everyone, right? I mean, this was like the end of religion was nigh. I think a friend of mine said of religious believers that they, now we, because I'm one of these people myself, are part of the Flat Earth Society. So I yawn at my father, I roll my eyes, I take the food that my mother has prepared, the laundry that she's done, put it in the back seat of the Oldsmobile that my dad had given me. You can cut the irony with a knife, right? Drive back down to the University of Illinois. And my girlfriend at the time is Jewish. And she calls me a week later, and I feel the tears in her throat. She says, Yitzhak Rabin has just been assassinated. This is October 95. And it was pretty clear to me pretty fast that this was not just a political issue for her. This was not just a current event. That she had a kind of a religious connection with this figure, who he was, what he was doing with the Palestinians. And it occurred to me that she and I had 1,000 conversations about identity. But we hadn't talked that much about this part of her identity that was now on the table and bleeding, and that was her religious identity. How is it that I was in this, this beautiful, intimate, romantic relationship, and my girlfriend and I had talked about being a person of color and being queer and being lower class and all of these issues, but we seemed to not have a language for her religious identity. Kind of amazing. We were both RAs, and I thought about RA training and how much of it dealt with identity and diversity issues. Like literally half of RA training, 40 hours, right, total. So 20 hours dealt with identity and diversity issues. Let me quantify for you exactly how much was focused on religion. 0. In my circle of RAs, we had trainings like 2 hours every other Wednesday night or something like that. And we would frequently do identity and diversity exercises, right? And things like, tell us about a time when you felt marginalized because of your identity. So people are going around the circle and they're telling powerful stories of growing up, working class or black or gay, etc. Powerful stories. And it gets to my friend Kizzer. And he says, last week in the dining hall, there was kind of an event that was deeply insulting to me. Some students, to blow off steam around midterms, evidently did something called a Viking dinner, where they went to the food line and they got a bunch of food and they went back to their table and they like smeared it all over themselves and did stupid things with mashed potatoes and roasted chicken and went back to and basically kept on doing this. And kids was like, I couldn't watch that. I had to take my tray and go eat in my room. And then Kizzer ends by saying, food is life, life is from God, I'm a Muslim, and that's just like core to who I am. And I looked around at my fellow RAs, and there were just blank looks. They weren't hostile, they just didn't know what to do with it, right? Like we'd spent all this time building a language and a vocabulary around identity issues and diversity, but almost no radar screen around religious identity and diversity. If somebody talks about their religious identity, you don't know where to put that. What are you supposed to do with that, right? And part of what was, so I'm like observing all of this. And it took me like 10 years to tell my dad that his comment to me had opened up my eyes around this. But that's a big part of it. Like literally, why aren't you paying attention to these palpably important front and center religious identity and diversity issues? Why don't you have a theory around that? Why don't you have frameworks and vocabulary around that? And so I started to pay attention, right? In the 1990s, when you look back, it's a decade of religious violence. I mean, what we think launches on September 11th actually launches a long time before, right? So 1993 is the first bombing of the World Trade Center. Mid-1990s is the bombing of the USS Cole. Late 1990s, just the bombings in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam. All of this is Al-Qaeda. All of this is the global announcements of Muslim extremism. My uncle is an ambassador in Nairobi at the time. He was 10 minutes late to work that day, which is why he's still alive. Right? So these are a big religious identity story. Early 1990s, the war in the Balkans. Slobodan Milosevic's soldiers would ride tanks through Sarajevo holding up the number 3. You know what 3 stood for? The Trinity. As in, we Christians are going to crush you Muslims. There's the Omagh bombing in the mid-1990s in Northern Ireland. There's the election of the BJP in 1998 in India, a Hindu nationalist party. One of its early moves is a nuclear test, which they call the Hindu bomb. Pakistan responds with a nuclear test that they call the Muslim bomb. There's a bombing at the Atlanta Olympics in 1996 by a man named Eric Rudolph, when Rudolph is arraigned in court and he is asked, when he goes to court and he's asked for a defense, he opens up the Bible and starts to read from the Bible. That is his defense, to read from the Bible. When Rabin's killer is asked in court if he had an accomplice, he says, yes, God. So finally, I'm starting to pay attention to this. And I'm starting to realize, wow, religion plays a really profound role in the world. And interestingly enough, there is another side of me that's growing as well, which is a religious side. Because as I'm watching all the ugliness that diverse religious identities are wreaking in current events, I'm also somehow realizing the power of religious identity to inspire really positive work. So I shared with your upper school students earlier today that one of my favorite lines by Martin Luther King Jr. is, many people want to make of me many things, but in the deep recesses of my heart, I'm a Baptist minister. I'm the son of a Baptist minister. I'm the grandson of a Baptist minister, and my commitment to Jesus as the Son of the living God is the highest commitment that I have. And I thought to myself, reading this line, how come nobody told me that Martin Luther King Jr. was Christian? How come nobody told me what role that played in his life? Right? It was always Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., not so much Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. And as I started to think about the faith identity of King and the role that faith plays in his life, something else occurs to me, that almost all of my social justice heroes across the board were people of faith. Mahatma Gandhi, Dorothy Day, Malcolm X, the Aga Khan, Mother Teresa, Thich Nhat Hanh, the Dalai Lama, on and on and on. And so you can imagine kind of the Manichaean framework of a 20-year-old mind finally paying attention to religious identity and diversity in the news and seeing it wreak all kinds of havoc in the world, and at the same time recognizing the powerful role that religion has played in inspiring faith heroes. Towards the end of that decade in 1999, I was in South Africa for the Parliament of the World's Religions, and I saw Mandela speak. And Mandela comes onto the stage and he points out into the Cape towards Robben Island. And he says, I spent a quarter century of my life there, and I would still be there if it wasn't for the Christians and the Muslims and the Hindus and the Baha'is and the Jews and the African traditionalists of South Africa building the struggle against apartheid. And I remember thinking to myself, oh my gosh, nobody told me that the struggle against apartheid was an interfaith movement. And so I started to kind of take those eyes into other movements that I admired. And it turns out that the civil rights movement is an interfaith movement. It was basically the spine of the talk that I gave to your upper school today. King's various interfaith learnings and encounters, from Gandhi to Nehru to Heschel to Thich Nhat Hanh to Stanley Levinson. That is the story of King's Hindu, Jewish, Buddhist, secular humanist interactions. That's the thread of the civil rights movement. The Hind Swaraj movement in India is an interfaith movement. There's a man from Afghanistan, Badshah Khan, known as the Frontier Gandhi, who some people say was the closest companion of Mahatma Gandhi in the Hind Swaraj movement. Badshah Khan, a Muslim, would go with Gandhi to villages in India, and they would alternately read from the Bhagavad-Gita and the Quran as a way of building Muslim-Hindu cooperation in these villages, many of which were being torn apart by those issues. So again, there's this sense of like, wait a second, if I just pay attention to religious identity and diversity issues, it turns out that they're everywhere. They are shot up in my heroes. They're totally present in world affairs and current events. Turns out that they're the spine of several of the movements that I care about. Why is it that educational institutions, who to their great credit have expanded their radar screens around race, gender, sexuality, ethnicity, even class, but have paid scant attention to these things? Can you call yourself an educated person and a competent professional in early 21st century America without having some interfaith knowledge or skills? This is where I want to head now. I think it's one thing to think, okay, knowing some interfaith stuff, it's good for zealots. If you, Eboo, want to make this your PhD thesis, good for you. But one of the interesting facts about living in what Diana Eck calls the most religiously diverse nation in human history and the most religiously devout nation in the Western Hemisphere is that whether or not you want to deal with religious diversity, here it is front and center. And I think a big part of what a school does is it defines a standard that it calls educated person. And then it creates an environment which is meant to nurture people to that standard. So, what does a Blake graduate have to know about different religions, about the interfaith dimension of the civil rights movement, of what Mandela said on that stage about the struggle in South Africa, about, as I talked about at dinner today, the emergence of the idea of Judeo-Christian in American history, which didn't occur at the founding or even in the Civil War, but occurs in the 1930s as a response to anti-Catholicism and anti-Semitism. What does an educated person have to know about these things? And I think to myself, it wasn't until I got to college that I heard of Zora Neale Hurston or Toni Morrison or Ralph Ellison or Richard Wright or Phyllis Wheatley. I didn't know that there was a thing called black literature. I didn't know that there was an African American canon. In high school, and I went to, again, the top-rated public high school for one of the years I was in school in Illinois. I think we read 1 or 2 poems by Langston Hughes. You're just not educated if you don't have some familiarity with those writers. That's not a controversial thing to say now, right? What does one have to know about the great religions of the world or about their interaction in the history of this nation to call oneself an educated person? What does one have to be able to do to be a competent professional in a highly religiously diverse landscape? So let me give you a couple of examples about that. So whether you're a rabid Minnesota Vikings fan or a fair weather Bears fan as I am, What brings us together is we hate the Patriots. So I'm going to tell you a story that's a hate the Patriots story. There's also an interfaith theme here, just to let you know, just to stick with the topic of the talk. So a couple years ago, Monday Night Football, the Patriots are in Kansas City, and the Chiefs are crushing them, right? And I'm loving this. And in the second half, Hussein Abdullah, defensive back for the Kansas City Chiefs, picks Tom Brady off and runs it back into the end zone for a touchdown. And he puts the forehead of his helmet and the nose guard to the ground, and he stays there for a couple of minutes. Sizda al-Shukr, prayer of thanksgiving. Gets up, and he sees some laundry on the field. Ref has thrown a yellow flag, 15 yards, excessive celebration. And he runs back to the sideline, and I see he talking with his coach, Andy Reid, and I feel like Andy Reid coaches are often incensed at excessive celebration penalties, right? The dumbest thing you can do. But Andy Reid's not mad, not at Hussein Abdullah. Andy Reid's like, the ref didn't know you were praying. There is a prayer exemption to the excessive celebration rule. It's sometimes affectionately called the Tebow Exception, right? Tim Tebow never got flagged for going down on one knee or having John 3:16 under his eyes, and I don't think he should have. I mean, it makes perfect sense to me that you have excessive celebration penalties and there's a prayer exemption. So this NFL ref didn't know what Muslim prayer looked like, and he threw a bad flag. And the next day, the NFL Referees Association issued an apology. So there's lots of ways to look at this, but here's one. That ref screwed up his job that day. If you're an NFL ref and there's a prayer exemption to the excessive celebration rule, and you don't know how 1.7 billion people on the planet pray, you just didn't do your job well. It's just that simple. In other words, even for NFL refs, having some appreciative knowledge of the basics of the world religions is just an essential competence. It's a professional competence. It's no longer an afternoon coffee thing. It's now a morning coffee thing. You see what I'm saying? Afternoon coffee is one of those, it's a little bit cold out, I'll skip the latte today. Morning coffee, that's a need to have, right? You don't skip your morning coffee, right? It used to be that having fluency in religious diversity issues was for people like me, people who happen to be geeky about it. Now, if you're an NFL ref, you better know how people pray, because it's going to be part of your job. And if you're a doctor. So there's a great book by Ann Fadiman called The Spirit Catches You and You Fall Down. Anybody here familiar with that book? Oh, great. So here's a thumbnail summary of the story of the book. So it's about the Liu family, who is a Hmong family, and frequently I have to explain the Hmong community to folks, but folks in Minnesota know the Hmong community because there's several here, and I hope that there's some folks in the room who might be Hmong. In any case, they're a community from Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, and they were allies of the United States in the Vietnam War, and so the United States settles some hundreds of thousands of them here, many of them in Minnesota and upper Wisconsin, and some communities out on the West Coast. So the Liu family is part of this Hmong resettlement. And one day they wake up and their 12-month-old daughter, Leah, my memory serves me correctly, they notice her shaking uncontrollably. And they take her to the local hospital, which is a state-of-the-art facility with excellent physicians. And the physicians, I think the technical term is they freak out, right? It's a 12-month-old baby girl shaking uncontrollably. And they run all the tests that you would expect an excellent hospital and very good physicians to run. And unsurprisingly, they diagnose this as epilepsy, and they issue a cocktail of drugs. And as they're explaining these issues to the Liu family and running their tests, etc., the Liu family, father and mother, stone-faced, look totally unreceptive. And every time Leah has another set of uncontrollable shaking, the Liu family brings her in, and the doctors run their tests, and it turns out that the Liu family is not giving Leah the prescribed medication. And the doctors are deeply upset. They're caring physicians, and they're doing this for free, right? This family is never going to be able to pay a dime, and there's actually only a couple of physicians that have the specialty to do this, and so frequently they're woken up at like 3 in the morning, and they'll drive the 20 miles to the hospital, and they'll treat this girl and her family, and the parents aren't administering the medication properly. Ann Fadiman, the writer, alternates in different chapters, the Western doctor's perspective with the Hmong family's perspective. So he switches to the Hmong family's perspective. And their perspective is that, yes, there is something frightening happening with Leah's shaking. But the Hmong are a shaman community, shaman tradition. And part of their belief is that while there is a dimension of fear involved in Leah's shaking, there's also potentially something special going on, because the way that shamans are prepared in the Hmong community is by fits of uncontrollable shaking when they're young. So part of what's happening is that Leah might be being prepared for shamanhood. And the Liu family is extremely frustrated that these physicians seem to pay that no mind, seem to not recognize that that might be something that's going on, that they don't seem to know that part of what might have been happening is that Leah's spirit might have been captured and taken into a different dimension, and that part of the cure for that is to barter the spirits of sacrificed animals for Leah's spirit. They never ask about that. They never ask about the amulets around Leah's neck and the rare herbs that the Liu family has spent entire paychecks on, sending back to Laos and Cambodia and Vietnam. They never ask about the days and days that they have spent on road trips back to Minnesota so that Leah could be with senior shamans for healing ceremonies. Ann Fadiman, the anthropologist who writes this, points out that the doctors at some point get so frustrated that they call California Foster Care Services. And these foster care police officers show up at the doorstep of the Liu family, doesn't speak very much English, and they take this little girl away. Abuse and neglect. Fadiman goes through Leah's medical file, document after document after document, test after test, intake after intake. She gets to the first document, the first intake, and there's a section for religion. And under the section for religion, the person doing the intake has marked none. So just think for a moment. Your daughter is this doctor. She's a Blake graduate. She's gone to Wellesley and Penn. She's at the Merced healthcare facility. She has a specialty in this issue. Does she have to believe in the Hmong spiritual worldview that Leah's spirit might have been captured in order to be respectful of how her parents might be processing this? Is it possible to deal adroitly with a particular religious worldview in a healthcare facility, even as you are encouraging the family to take the Western medicine that you have prepared for 8 or 10 years to diagnose and administer? Could some version of that not be happening like 12 times right now within 10 square miles? That there is a Muslim or a Hindu or a Jew or an atheist or a Hmong shaman in a healthcare facility who doesn't have quite the same interpretation of a diagnosis or a cure that a doctor does? Isn't it part of the professional competence of a physician to be able to work within multiple frameworks at the very least to be able to code switch when necessary? I mean, how frequently does a doctor say to a patient, you gotta stop smoking or you gotta lose weight? And the patient says, all right, I'm gonna really try this time. I'm gonna do this, and I'm gonna pray hard to God. Does the doctor have to believe in God or that patient's version of God in order to say, you know what, I believe you, and we're gonna work on this together, and you're gonna do everything that you can do, and I'm gonna do everything that I can do? Doctor ever say, that's I mean, just get on the treadmill, forget this God business? No. Why? Because good doctors are able to work within the cultural and spiritual frameworks of their patients, even when they don't fully believe in them. So, as America gets more religiously diverse, and it is increasingly commonplace that Hmong shamans show up as your patients, not to mention your colleagues and your bosses, the inability to work within those frameworks, whether that's like ordering the right kind of food or knowing when not to hold a holiday party or recognizing that actually this family is treating its daughter, just not in the way that we are. And if we are respectful about this family's process, maybe we can encourage them to take this medication as well. Isn't that not a specialty, but a matter of basic professional competence? If you're a physician in America in the 21st century. By the way, note, this story is not Chicago, New York, LA, San Francisco, Seattle, Minneapolis. It's Merced, California. Final story. So my son Zaid is 10. And as I've said multiple times today, we're a devoted Muslim family, relatively liberal and flexible in our approach to things, devoted nonetheless. And one of the things our kids have known from the get-go is we don't eat pork, right? It's actually a wonderful thing it's a wonderful way of even young kids being able to carry out their identity, because they're reminded with some frequency at cafeteria lunches by having to say, is there pork in that, right? They're having to affirm their own religious identity, even if it's uncomfortable. I think that that's important. So anyway, a couple years ago, Zaid trades sandwiches with a friend of his at lunch. The meat looks like turkey. He takes a bite. Turns out it doesn't taste like turkey. He says to his friend, hey, what is this? His friend says it's ham. Zaid gets very upset. Zaid comes into class at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, puts his head in his desk. This is not typical Zaid behavior. Miss Lazat says, Zaid, what's wrong? And Zaid only says, I ate ham. Right? So think about this. This, by the way, this happened a dozen times today in the Twin Cities, right? Some Muslim or Jewish kid accidentally ate ham. Some Hindu kid or Jain kid accidentally ate soup with chicken stock in it. And they're upset. And Zaid puts his head down on the desk and think about what Miss Lazat has to do in a split second. She has to recognize, name is Zaid, ate ham, he's upset. That's the evidence that I have. Okay, he's probably Muslim. He's not allowed to eat pork. We hadn't talked to the teachers about this, right? So it's not like they knew up front. He's probably Muslim. He's not allowed to eat pork. It's not a fatal sin if an 8-year-old kid makes a mistake and eats pork one day. So what does she have to do? She has to affirm his religious identity. Zaid, I know you're Muslim and that not eating pork is an important part of your religion. And I know you made a mistake and that's okay and everyone will understand. It's okay and everyone will understand. I want you to be able to participate in class today, right? You probably also have to know that, in America in 2015, when you're 8, you might not want to out yourself as a Muslim at the lunch table after eating ham. So if you're a teacher, you got to do all of that right away and figure out what you're doing with your 30 other students who are squirreling around and start math class. If you haven't thought about it until that moment, if you've never been in an ed school class where your professor has said, how should we think about the religiously diverse classroom of the 21st century in America? What various things might our students bring to the class? Everything from religious rituals and holidays to discomforts and awkwardnesses. How do these play out against the backdrop of broader cultural issues in America? Miss Lazat obviously had some version of that, which is why in that instant, she could play the role of, okay, I get it. I'm gonna be affirming. I'm going to tell him, I understand the importance of your identity, that you made a mistake, and that's okay. People will understand and forgive you, and please participate in class. If you pay no attention to religious identity and diversity issues until that moment, you're going to get that wrong. And by the way, your affect with an 8-year-old is everything. I don't need to tell this audience that, right? There's a way of doing that in a clunky way and getting the words right and not making the kid feel whole. And there's a way of doing that in an, I get it, it's smooth, it's perfectly fluid, and you're gonna participate in class today. It's a matter of basic competence. If you're gonna be a teacher in the American classroom in the 21st century, these are your students. So I view this as a story of strength to strength, right? I view America as having done reasonably well on these issues over the course of our history. And the question is, what's the next chapter going to be, right? What's the next chapter going to be? There's a great insight in Michael Walzer's book, What It Means to Be an American. He says, from the beginning of political philosophy, from the Greeks, philosophers believed that you could only have diversity under a dictatorship. If you wanted to have a democracy, you had to have homogeneity. Because why would one ethnic or religious or racial group ever allow somebody from a different ethnicity, religion, or race to rule over them? That will never happen. Human nature doesn't work that way, right? He ends that section and he begins the next one with this line, until the United States of America. We live in the first religiously diverse democracy. I mean, the words of our founding fathers, they sound so 2017. George Washington, in a document called Letter to the Hebrew Congregation of Newport, Rhode Island, all will have a like liberty of conscience. This government will give to bigotry no sanction and persecution no assistance. You could say that now. I wish more people did, actually. That's late 18th century. Ben Franklin made donations to every faith community in Philadelphia and said, here's my hope. All of you thrive, and on the 4th of July, you celebrate it together, and when I die, you carry my coffin in the streets of Philadelphia as a group. That's early 19th century Philadelphia, founding father, right? So we begin with a set of strengths when it comes to America as an interfaith nation. I think the interesting question is, now that we have appreciable communities of Hindus, Buddhists, Muslims, what does the next chapter look like? What's the next chapter look like? Thank you.
When the universe harmonizes with how you're feeling. Thank you so much for that warm applause. Eboo's just taking a minute to get a breath and have a drink of water. He's open to taking questions from this audience. And Marie Michael is in the crowd with a mic so that we can all hear each other in the spirit of this conversation today. So please raise your hand if you're interested in asking a question. Wait for the mic to get passed to you. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
I enjoyed the stories at dinner about your father. My challenge to you is, just tell us the story about your father that you never dared to tell before now.
One that I haven't told yet?
Right. Are there any?
Oh, I'm sure that there's a lot. So I will think over the course of the Q&A session, I will think of that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep. He wants to know a secret about my dad.
I have a question for you.
Great. Can you come to the center so I can see you? Thanks. Yeah.
So as you were talking about the identities of two different sets of identities, right? One is religious identity, another is a personal, individual identity in terms of who you are physically, right? So one of the things that comes to my mind is when you talk about equality, right? We are talking about equality in the sense if you're straight, gay, or whatever you want to, dark-skinned, light-skinned. We are talking about equality from a human perspective, right? You want everybody to treat everybody else the same. And that is grounded in the notion that human beings are all equal. When you, and there's a factual, you could argue that there's a factual angle to it because you want all humans to be the same, and so you're coming from that angle and you want to treat everybody the same, right? When you talk about religious identity, now you bring in a subjective component to it, right? And as you said, in order for a doctor to treat a patient of a different religion, the doctor doesn't have to believe in that religion, right? But when you're talking about a subjective component and want to somehow have that conversation open, that becomes doesn't it become a little bit different from the other conversation? And that adds a little bit more complication because in order for you to really work with your trueness in your heart, you need to believe in the other person in order for you to kind of really bridge the gap. Whereas in this side, you believe that all humans are equal. Do you see where I'm coming from?
Yes. I think this is a profound question, right? And I think one of the ways, I think part of what you're asking is religious identity philosophically different than other identities?
Better way of putting it, yeah, sure.
No, you asked it, I just summarized it. And because I carry the baggage of graduate school, I'm going to say it depends. Right? And because I'm a Chicago pragmatist at heart, instead of trying to solve the problem in theory, I'm going to go to the practical realm and say, given that people from different religions frequently feel that their tradition has a fullness of truth, not shared by others, how is it that they can cooperate on something of an equal plane with others? And the way that I would answer that question is, let's see the situations in which it is already happening. Do you see what I'm saying? So in other words, instead of trying to solve the problem in theory, one of my favorite stories is I think this is no longer true, but back when I was in high school, I learned that physicists couldn't figure out how the bumblebee flew, like the body was too big, the wings were too small. The bumblebee didn't care, it just flew, right? And that's supposed to be funny. Thank you. Sometimes I have to juice the laughter. I think that that's the way identity and diversity issues work, right? So we can get all knotted up in theory. Like, how is it that Muslims with a very, very focused monotheism could ever get along with Hindus with these various gods and idols to God when Muslims don't believe in they can never be friends in that frame. And then there's this Hindu dude and Muslim dude walking down the street hanging out. being perfectly friendly. And you're like, well, you don't exist in theory. And they're like, yeah, but we're friends, right? So I'm really interested in that. I'm really interested in sports environments in which evangelical Christians and atheists are linebackers in the same team. I'm really interested in, again, I'm a big Fighting Irish fan. So the Mormon tradition, the Latter-day Saints tradition in some ways can be viewed as an alternative ecclesiology to Catholicism. In other words, that the Catholic Church is a false church and the way that the Latter-day Saints run their church is the true church. And Manti Te'o, who was an observant Mormon, was the best defensive player in the country when he was at Notre Dame, the American Vatican, 10 years ago, playing middle linebacker. Right? So I'm really interested in those situations. Yes, in theory, this is very, very hard. And in practice, it actually happens all the time. So the question that I'm most interested in, and you can kind of see the sociologist in me, is what are the conditions in which people from fundamentally different religions seem to cooperate the best, and can we expand those conditions? So my guess is people from different religions probably cooperate pretty well in medical environments. And probably it's not because they are totally irreligious in medical environments, right? Frequently Muslim doctors will pray in their offices. Frequently Hindu doctors will have pictures of Ganpati in their offices. It's because, here's a theory, a different part of their religious identity is engaged, the healer part. So they are a Muslim in that environment, but the dimension of Islam that is most salient is the dimension that is being a mercy upon all the worlds. It's a direct line from the Quran, right? And so the question that I find myself asking is how do we create environments that make inspiring common ground more salient? Here and then here, and then here. Yes?
I was so happy that you referenced the Founding Fathers, because the First Amendment's always been a very favorite of mine, that says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Now that gets written between the First Great Awakening and the Second Great Awakening during basically a secular time in our country. Many of the Founding Fathers, though being Christians, were fairly secular. Jefferson or Washington or Madison for three. Where are we on that spectrum today? And what is the status of the First Amendment?
Right. Oh, easy questions, right? So this is something that Anne actually wanted me to address. There's a great line, I think this was by the dean of the law school at Berkeley, he said, diversity is not rocket science, it's harder, right? So what happens when you have diverse identities in intense interaction and those identities are in tension with one another, right? What happens when the Obama administration, based on a study of women's health, requires contraception in insurance mandates, and a closely held private corporation says it is against our religious conviction to offer contraception. We believe it's an abortifacient, and sues. Is that a First Amendment issue? Is that a religious freedom issue? So I think that was 5-4 at the Supreme Court. I find these fascinating questions, right? But one thing that, and I have views and leanings on a variety of things, but one thing that I'm pretty sure about is that we can't say some identities matter, but not other identities, right? So people with religious convictions have a right to say, people, for example, I happen to be socially progressive with lots of friends in more conservative circles, and am very interested in conversations that involve multiple camps, recognizing that those are going to be disagreements. So when my progressive friends say to me, you shouldn't be able to bring up your religious conviction in American law. That identity shouldn't matter. I'm like, well, there's this little thing called the First Amendment, right? And also, would you say that about Muhammad Ali when he won at the Supreme Court and didn't have to go to jail because he got conscientious objector status in the Vietnam War based on being Muslim? One can't have it both ways. Either identity matters and has a set of implications, or it doesn't. And we should just expect that diverse identities in intense interaction are occasionally going to have tensions. We should just expect it. And that sounds really simple, right? But at least for me, it's hugely helpful to expect conflict. It's like the mountain climber, when she comes to the mountain on the landscape, isn't like, what the heck are you doing here? She's prepared to climb the mountain. If you open the door to an identity and diversity conversation, expect tension, right? And what does that mean? It means you now have to have a mode to deal with the tension that is inevitably going to come up. And that mode has to be civil discourse. So if I can register my identity, you can register yours. You might not like every implication of my identity. I'm not going to like every implication of yours. Let's expect that's going to happen every once in a while. Let us stipulate to listening and sharing gently. Like, that's why that manner of speaking to each other is not just Minnesota nice. It is also, I think, essential in a diverse democracy, either a micro community like Blake or the nation at large. Here and then here.
So I guess that was not at all my question, but you sort of answered my question in his answer. I guess I was just wondering what happens when religion starts to bleed into, now there are laws that are really based on a particular religion. Where does that play into to your
So I think this is hard. You know, I think it's hard, and I think that we should expect tensions, right? I'll just repeat a little bit of this, right? Expect tension. Open the door to identity. Expect conflict between some identities. Have modes in which that conflict is negotiated. Try not to begin conversations with the line, "I always knew you were a bigot." That almost never goes well. Sir, you had a question?
You were speaking, I was along the line when you were speaking, I was always wondering, with the religious identity, in our current state, how well would that go over with racial and social injustice if you offered that as an answer to some of the things that are currently going on as a remedy? Would that be your first offer? And it seems like you're talking about reaching democratic diversity rather than pluralism, and talking about the tension that's logically going to occur, and that has occurred. But it seems like it's been controlled by power structures that be. I wanted to hear your response to that. I guess I'm not feeling that if you came and offered that as a solution to the people who are being downtrodden right now, and that it would be received as well, even though it might have credence in the long run, to tell them that this is going to save you, or be an answer, a solution to your problem, a solution to all the things that happened to you and your community, that this would be a first choice of action right now.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. Right? This isn't what I am saying is not meant to replace other important issues, and it's not meant to be a solution to every issue. It is to raise a critical issue that, in my experience, is not always at the table in the same kind of way. An issue that has all kinds of conflicts and tensions within it, but all kinds of opportunities and possibilities as well. And it's not a solution to, it's not the full solution to anything from climate change to unequal policing. On the other hand, because of the massive amounts of social capital that religious communities have, everything from buildings to networks to budgets, etc., it is not a coincidence that religious communities have been on the front lines of a range of social change movements in the United States. Not everyone, right? But from abolition to civil rights, it's hard to imagine those movements without partnerships between religious communities. It seems to me that as the climate change movement in the secular world and the creation care movement in the evangelical world find ways to like talk to each other without beginning with the line, "I always knew you were a bigot," that probably has a better chance of addressing broader climate change issues than those communities working alone. It's very interesting to me to notice that secular folks on the left are deeply disturbed by sex trafficking, and people in the evangelical world are deeply disturbed by sex trafficking. I can't help think, but a partnership there would be useful, right? So that's a downtrodden group, if there is one, are young girls being sex trafficked, right? And again, the largest, the movements that have emerged to address that issue have largely emerged in the progressive left and in the evangelical right. I'm always interested in when that happens. I pay a lot of attention to that and ask the question, what does it look like for these people to recognize that they can disagree on A, B, and C and work together on X, Y, and Z? Give you maybe my favorite example of this. So an awful lot of attention these days to inequalities in the criminal justice system. And I know something about this because my wife is a civil rights attorney who tried cases for 13 years, had 14 federal trials, largely around police misconduct issues. And amongst the earliest movements in the mid-late 20th century that addressed prisoner issues was Chuck Colson, the former Nixon guy who has an evangelical conversion in in prison, and starts a prison program that does an awful lot of facilitation of prisoner reentry into society, right? And it starts like 30 years ago. And again, it seems to me that my friends who are part of typically the progressive left have a lot in common with what Chuck Colson started 25, 30 years ago, and what would it look like for those to work together. So again, I don't think that what I am proposing, it's not meant to be every problem or a panacea to every problem. It oftentimes has nurtured social capital and inspiring rhetoric to deal with a range of interesting issues. Having said that, that is not the only reason that I am personally interested in this, right? I think issues of religiously diverse democracy, religious pluralism are interesting and important in and of themselves, even if, like, my son eating a ham sandwich at school is not the worst problem in America, right? Or Leah Lou having seizures and not being treated properly because the doctors can't speak across her parents' religious belief. Even those might not be like New York Times front page issues, but they're everyday workplace issues. And asking the question, what does it look like to be an educated person and a competent professional around those, seems to me a useful question to ask. Yes?
I have a 19-year-old son who isn't here because he's studying religion and public policy, second year in university. I'm appealing to your pragmatic Chicago side. And he and I talk a lot about where does this interest lead. So he's very interested in interfaith work. He's very interested in the intersection of moral and ethical speech with creating public spaces where people with diversity can work together. but I, as a parent who's investing a lot in his education, am thinking, so what does that look like as a job when you're done with university? And as a group of parents here who maybe understand the call for the importance of this in the world, where are the places that people who are interested in this work are finding things to do? Does that make sense?
Yeah, right. My parents for the longest time were going to be like, you're going to do really well in school, and then you're going to be unemployed for a really long time. So look, part of why I emphasize professional competence is because, if I'm the CEO of a hospital system, if I run a community development corporation, if I'm a mayor with an increasingly religiously diverse city, right, which by the way is lots of places in America right now, I want people with interfaith leadership and literacy. You are unlikely to find interfaith leader in a job ad unless it's my organization advertising, right? But the ability to work positively across religious diversity in ways that serves people, builds understanding and cooperation is going to be highly relevant in any setting that deals principally with humans. Healthcare, community development, education, urban policy, et cetera, et cetera. Your son needs to be able to tell a story about himself, and it is more about practice than it is about theory, which is to say, it's more about, here's how I have actually done this. I helped to coach a soccer team of kids from 7 different religions, and that's not that different than working in a hospital situation across 17 different religions, right? It's more about the, can you do this? But it seems to me, look, my own sense, just to editorialize a little bit here, robots are going to replace everybody except for people who deal with people. I'm serious, right? Like if you can write it down, a robot will replace it. But if you are dealing with people, it's unlikely robots are going to replace kindergarten teachers, because humans become humans around other humans. So as much as elite educational environments sometimes look up to STEM stuff and look down at humanity stuff, I think to myself, yeah, if you wind up at Google, good for you. If you're everybody else, if you can write it down, a robot will replace it. But if you are good at dealing with humans, it is very hard to imagine a robot replacing a doctor who has to talk to you. And humans are about diversity. Then we had a couple more questions over here, and then we'll close here, and then these 2 gentlemen.
Thank you for this evening, first of all. I, like you, grew up, I'm first generation, and grew up where assimilation was just what you did. And I, too, didn't think it was something that was being done to you or wrong, it was just what you did. And I choose to believe that the adults around me were doing the best that they could with all the best intentions. We've clearly, I'll say some schools have sort of missed the mark on maybe the religious teaching, and we're trying to correct that in some way. I wonder, when you look at high school students now, and for those of us who have agency in education, what's the thing, maybe future thinking, what's the thing that our students, when they grow, they'll say, gosh, that's the new issue that we should have been taught about. Where are we missing the mark now?
I don't know. That's a great question. I don't know. I don't know. But I do know enough. I do not know enough to say this. I am an awful lot less self-righteous than I used to be, and I'm an awful lot more modest about my characterizations of the world, other people, and myself. Because I just, just to tell a quick story. I live in a very blue part of a blue city, right? You could barely hear a whisper the day Trump got elected, right? Like it was just like distraught. And amongst the only Trump supporters I ever talked to personally, I'm embarrassed to say this, I'm embarrassed to say that my world is so undiverse that I didn't have cross-political conversations. Amongst the only Trump supporters I talked to was my driver from Newark Airport to Princeton, and I spoke at Princeton a couple years ago. And I was going there to do a diversity talk, and we're talking about his support for Trump and blah, 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 blah. And it's a nice conversation. I'm learning, in the back, and I'm like, what about this statement and this statement, and he's like, I didn't like this on it, right? So I'm challenging him. He's being nice about it, et cetera. And then we almost we're almost there, and he says, what did you think when Hillary said we're going to put a lot of coal miners out of work? And I'm like, I don't remember her saying that. And he said, nobody I drive to Princeton ever remembers her saying that. I don't know any coal miners. He does. I know that my candidate didn't mean it that way. A lot of her supporters didn't know that many coal miners. I learned something, right? And so I'm just a lot more modest in my characterizations of other people, the world, and myself. It's a million things that I learn all the time.
So, at the basic level of a mosque and a church, a synagogue, from your experience, what has worked and what hasn't worked? Or what would you recommend for us?
In a tri-faith partnership? It's a great question. I don't have a ton of experience in this. I met one of your colleagues who's working on that. The honest to God answer is I don't know, but I think it's a really worthy endeavor, and I think you ought to feel really proud that you guys are engaged in it. I would only say, so I don't know anything specific about that. I would only say, be like the mountain climber. When you hit attention, expect it. Don't be mad. Just be like, oh yeah, here's the mountain. We prepared for this. We prepared for this, right? We knew this was going to happen. We didn't know what it was going to be about. It could be about parking. It could be about international politics. Who knows, right? We prepared for it. We're not surprised that our religions and orientations around them are actually different. We're not surprised that this is hard, and it's worth it, and we're going to stick with it. Last question.
So as a sociologist, what's your opinion about this new movement around the world about nationalism? And I sort of heard you use the term progressive left. And hardcore nationalists would be very, on a spectrum, would be very opposite
Right.
to any interfaith issues. Is it a spectrum that we're dealing with? Is it more than just what meets the eye? Are these undercurrents of political issues? And what is it about, as a corollary to this, is what is it about every religion that even within a religion, people sort of tend to view each other on extremes of spectrum and even have issues within the framework?
Yeah. So I have a lot to say. I mean, there's could be a whole talk on this, and I am afraid that if I open my mouth too much, I will just keep talking, and I've got a sense that people are like, you better not talk that much more, my man. Look, I think identity is a core part of what it means to be human. And when the story is no longer true, the story that you are told and that you believe is no longer true, I think people, they revolt, right? So I'm a big Springsteen fan. Anybody a Springsteen fan in here? So you remember The River, 1980? You remember the line? And then I got married pregnant, and man, that was all she wrote. And for my 18th birthday, I got a union card and a wedding coat. Okay, so that was written as a lament. That was written at a time in which getting a union card and a wedding coat at 18 was a given. How many people in America would be like, I'll take that era back? That's not a lament, that's a dream now. 40 years later, that's a dream. So that's a story that makes up an idea. Those are Updike novels, right? Those are Springsteen songs. And that way of being, it's hard to do that in America anymore. right? That song is not about I can't make ends meet. That song is about I'm trying to be a poet and it's not happening because I got to feed my family, but at least I got a job that can do that, right? So when as Mark said, all that is solid melts into air, I think that people try to find something solid. And I think to myself all the time, if I was born in a hunter society, I'd be done. If I was born in a warrior society, I'd be done, right? I am not made for a warrior. I happen to be one of the few human beings that was made for a knowledge society. So think about how lucky I am, right? I happen to be good at reading, writing, and thinking at a time in which reading, writing, and thinking is king. I'm not better than any other human being in history. I just happen to be born at a time in which my skill set and who I am aligns with the society in which I live. If I had been born into the vast majority of human societies and the vast majority of human history, I would be middling at best, right? So what happens if one day somebody says, hey, this knowledge society thing, we're de-knowledgeizing. You heard about de-industrial? We're de-knowledgeizing. But hey, we could retrain you to be a middle linebacker, right? And my identity, that's my professional identity, is gone, right? I mean, I'd be mad, right?
I think instinctually, human beings revert to tribalism
Right.
when they're threatened.
Look, I mean, I'm reading Sebastian Junger's Tribe, Junger. So it's powerful, right? I'll end on this, and this is, I generally end on a happy note. I don't think this is that happy of a note, but it opens, it's only 100 pages long, and it's basically about how how people who are in war, why the reason they like war makes sense, makes human sense, right? And they like it because they're a part of a tribe, they're a part of a platoon, right? And Sebastian Junger argues that this is how we've evolved, that we've evolved over tens of thousands of years to want to convene in groups of 50 to 60 in tribal units and to be deeply connected to those people. And modern Western civilization, which I happen to really like, right? But again, my skill set, my way of being just happens to align with this. He points out that this is an invention of the last couple hundred years. So you have tens of thousands of years of other ways that humans are organized. In the last couple hundred years, we've had industrial societies at a macro level that are now knowledge societies, okay? And then he points out, and this is the beginning of this book, he said, in colonial America, there were dozens and dozens of examples of early European Americans leaving Jamestown, Massachusetts, etc., to join Native American tribes. And in fact, in prisoner exchanges, we'll trade 5 of our POWs for 5 of yours. There were frequent examples of the 5 Euro-Americans who had been captured by the Native American tribe and lived with them for 5 years, not wanting to come back. And Benjamin Franklin points out, it almost never happened in reverse. That's a striking insight, right? It is a striking insight to think that the way human beings have evolved is to almost neurologically want those kinds of units and identities. Now, I think, right, this is an editorial take. This is an area in which I see Islam and America as being very similar, that Islam and America are both superstructures that are meant to absorb tribal identities without killing them, which is why you can be an Irish American or a Muslim American. You can be at Blake's school and a gay American, right? And the notion is, and you can be a Saudi Muslim or an Indian Muslim or a Pakistani Muslim, right? Islam emerges in the early 7th century in the Arabian Peninsula. It was respectful of clan and tribe identities, but it was meant to be a superstructure identity. So it was meant to bind tribes and clans under a larger and more powerful identity while letting them keep tribal and clan identities, which effectively obviates the need for conflicts between them because their principal identity is Muslim, but it allows them to continue marrying within tribe and clan, et cetera, et cetera. Same with America, right? Which is why, this is of course the ideal, which is why when Indians and Pakistanis move to the United States, they're taught to hate each other from the beginning of the school system. Been 3 wars between India and Pakistan in the last 60 years. A couple have almost gone nuclear, right? When they move to Chicago, they live within the same 12 square blocks in West Rogers Park. That's fast. That is a stunning achievement. It is a stunning achievement to be a nation that can say, you know what, you can be a proud Indian American, but you can't kill the Pakistanis in the next block. Because I'm serious, I'm dead serious, right? And we almost never think about the fact that groups that are at each other's throats on the other side of the world live cheek by jowl in America and largely get along. And if they're mad at each other, they're mad by way of boycott and demonstration and almost never by way of violence. That is a stunning achievement, right? The issue is that it's also an extremely delicate balance. It's an extremely delicate balance to allow for some constituent identities and also to maintain a superstructure identity, right? And how we figure that out is going to be, I think it's going to be one of the great issues of the century. Thanks, everyone.